My name is Bertel Knack, and the morning the world stopped working, I was driving Route 14 out of Halverson Elementary in a 1999 Bluebird with a stuck blower fan and a coffee can ashtray under the seat that wasn't mine. I'd been driving school routes for the Halverson Township District for 19 years by then. Before that, I was a mechanic at a freight outfit in Sturtevant, and before that, I was nothing in particular. Just a kid from a town where most people did one of 3 jobs, and the third one was driving. My wife Marlis had passed in the spring of the year before, and I'd kept the route partly for the money and partly because I couldn't stand the house when it was quiet. Children, even other people's children, are the opposite of a quiet house. They argue about lunch trades and who said what on the bus the day before, and whose mother said they could have a phone, and the noise of it scrubs the inside of your head clean. Route 14 ran the long looping loop out the east side of town, past the grain elevator, down County Trunk H, through the trailer park at Wessler's Corner, then back through the new subdivisions along Aldrich Road. It was a heavy route. The full count varied by day, depending on absences and parent pickups, but on a normal Tuesday, I'd have between 35 and 38 kids on board, ranging from kindergartners with name tags safety pinned to their coats, up through 6th graders who thought they were already in high school. The middle schoolers and high schoolers were on different buses. Mine was elementary only. That morning I had a full house. I remember because the dispatcher, Jolene, had radioed before I left the lot to let me know 2 of my regular absences were back from a stomach bug, and to ask if I'd grab a kindergartner named Pell, whose usual driver had called in. So I had every bench seated, and a few of the smallest kids doubled up to leave room for backpacks. The number was on my clipboard. I'd counted them at pickup the way I always did. Not because I was paranoid, but because 30 years of working insurance-adjacent jobs teaches you to count. The first leg of the route was uneventful. We left the school at 3:15. Afternoon route, not morning, under a sky the color of wet concrete. Late October, the kind of light where the corn stubble in the fields looks the same color as the road. The kids were loud the way they're always loud on a Tuesday. Tuesday is not Friday and not Monday. It's a low-stakes day, and they treat it like a porch. I noticed the first wrong thing at the 4-way stop where Bremerton Road meets H. There were 2 state patrol cars parked nose-to-nose across the southbound lane, and a trooper standing in the road waving traffic east. He didn't have his hat on. That was the part that registered before anything else did. A state trooper without his hat, in uniform, in the road. I rolled down my window, and he waved me through hard, with the flat of his hand, the way you wave someone past an accident you don't want them to look at. "What's the trouble?" I asked. "Just keep moving, sir. Eastbound only. Don't stop." "I've got a route. I've got drop-offs at Wessler's." He looked at the bus then. He looked at the windows where the kids' faces were pressed up against the glass, the way kids do, automatically, whenever the bus stops anywhere it doesn't normally stop. His face did something I've thought about a lot since. It went through 3 expressions inside of 1 second. Annoyance, then a kind of surprised pity, then a professional flatness clamping down over both. "Where do they live?" "Wessler's, then Aldrich, then the Birchwood subdivision." "Wessler's is closed off. Don't go there. Aldrich and Birchwood are still open as far as I know. But sir, you keep that door shut. You hear me? Whatever you see, you keep it shut, and you keep moving until you get them home." I started to ask him what I was supposed to see. He'd already turned away. Behind his cruiser there was something on the shoulder under a blue tarp, and a man in a fluorescent vest standing with a shotgun pointed at the ground. I didn't process the shotgun until I was already a quarter mile down the road. The kids had felt it. That's the thing people who don't work with children don't understand. Children are antennas. By the time I'd put the bus back into gear, the noise level had dropped by half. The little ones were quiet because the older ones were quiet. And the older ones were quiet because they'd seen the trooper's face through the windshield and registered, the way kids do, that an adult with authority had been afraid. A girl named Renly, who was in 4th grade and sat 3 benches back on the right, leaned out into the aisle and asked, "Mr. Knack, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, sweetie. There's just an accident up the road. We're going a different way." "Is somebody dead?" "I don't know what's there, Renly. Sit down on your bottom, please." She sat down. I checked the radio. The district frequency was clear. No static, no chatter. That was the second wrong thing. At 3:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, with 20-some buses on the road, that channel should have been somebody's voice every 20 seconds. Jolene quizzing a sub-driver about a turnaround. Somebody asking for confirmation on an early dismissal. The shop calling someone in for a brake check. Dead air at 3:30 was unnatural. I keyed the mic. "Dispatch, this is 14. Dispatch, 14. Over." Nothing. "Dispatch, 14. Do you copy?" A long pause, and then a voice I didn't recognize, breathing hard. 14. This is Doug. I'm in the shop. Jolene's not here. Where are you?" Doug was the head mechanic. He was not supposed to be on the radio. "East of Bremerton on H. State Patrol turned me around from Wessler's. What's going on, Doug?" "Bertle, you need to get those kids home. Or back here. There's something happening. The police scanner's been going crazy for an hour. People biting people. They told us to lock the school, and they did. They sent the rest of the buses out and locked the school. And now I can't reach Jolene. I'm at the shop. I think she went home." "Biting people?" "That's what they're saying. I know how it sounds. Bertle, just get them somewhere. Use your head." The radio cut. I tried him back twice. He didn't answer. I want to be honest about what I felt at that moment, because it's the kind of thing that gets edited later in the retelling. I felt embarrassed. That was the first feeling. Embarrassed at having heard the words "people biting people" come out of an adult's mouth on a district radio, and embarrassed at having to take it seriously. The second thing I felt, underneath the embarrassment, was a pulling sensation behind my sternum that I recognized from the morning Marlis had her stroke. The sensation of the day having gone sideways in a way that wouldn't be coming back. I had a route plan, and I had a clipboard with addresses, and I had 30-some children whose parents expected to see them at a corner within the next 40 minutes. So I drove the route. That's what I want anyone reading this to understand. I didn't make some heroic decision. I drove the route, because driving the route was the thing I knew how to do. And because every alternative I could think of in that first half hour required me to invent a system that didn't exist. Aldrich Road was the next stop sequence. I had 7 kids getting off along Aldrich in 3 clusters. I pulled up to the first stop, the one by the white mailbox with the wooden goose on top, and I looked at the house for a long time before I opened the door. The house looked normal. There were 2 cars in the driveway and a light on in the kitchen. A woman came out the front door at a half run when she saw the bus, and she had her phone in her hand, and she was crying. And I knew before she got to the door that she was the mother of the boy named Cully, who sat in the 3rd row. She got him off the bus. She said thank you 4 times. She asked me if I'd heard, and I said I'd heard a little. And she said her husband was a paramedic, and he'd called her from the hospital and told her to lock the doors, and she didn't know what was happening, and she was sorry. She was sorry. She had to go. She ran back inside with her son under her arm like he was a sack of feed. The next stop on Aldrich was 2 houses. Both kids got off, and both had a parent at the corner. One of the parents, a man I knew slightly named Gareth Pelk, who worked at the co-op, asked me where I was going next. Birchwood, then back. Don't go through the trailer park. State Patrol already told me. I'm going around. There's something at the trailer park, Bertel, I'm telling you. Somebody called my brother and told him not to come into town. Whatever you do, don't go through the trailer park. I told him I wouldn't. I closed the door. I drove. The third Aldrich stop was the one that should have told me, if I'd been listening. There were 4 kids getting off there at 3 different houses along a quarter-mile stretch. The first house had a parent waiting. The second house didn't. The third house didn't either. I pulled up at the second house, a split level with a basketball hoop in the driveway, and I waited the standard 90 seconds with the door open and the stop arm out, and nobody came. The kid was a 3rd grader named Peter Bonesack. He stood up on his own, put his backpack on, walked to the front of the bus, and looked out the door at his empty driveway. "My mom's not here," he said. "Is she usually here?" "Yes." "Does she work?" "She works from home." I looked at the house. The garage door was up. There was a car in the garage. The kitchen light was on. It looked like a house where a woman had been doing something 5 minutes ago and would be back in 5 minutes. I should not have let him off the bus. I want to say that plainly. By every district policy and every instinct I had, I should not have let a 3rd grader walk into an empty house when I'd just been told by a state trooper to keep my doors closed and keep moving. But Peter looked at me and said, "I have a key. It's okay. My mom forgets sometimes." I asked him if he had her phone number. He did. I had him call from my cell phone because cell phones weren't allowed on the bus for kids, and he'd left his at home anyway. The call rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I tried the number again. Same. I had a decision to make and about 11 seconds to make it. The other kids were watching. The 4th grader, Renly, was leaning out into the aisle again. The next house on the route was visible up the road, and I could see a woman standing in her front yard, waving both arms at the bus. Behind her, 2 houses down, a screen door was banging open and shut in a wind that wasn't blowing. "Peter," I said, "you're going to ride with me a little longer. We're going to come back. Sit down." He didn't argue. He went back to his seat. I closed the door. I drove on to the woman in the yard and let her son off, and she ran toward the bus the same way the first mother had. And when she saw Peter still on the bus through the window, she grabbed my arm through the open door and asked who else wasn't getting off, and I told her. And she said, "Take them to the elementary. The elementary is locked. Don't go to Birchwood." "Why not Birchwood?" "My sister lives in Birchwood." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I sat in the bus at her corner for what felt like a long time, but was probably 20 seconds. I'd estimate, without recounting, somewhere around 25 children still on board. I had a route plan that called for 2 more stops along Aldrich, and then a long swing through the Birchwood subdivision, which had the largest concentration of my drops, and then back through town past the elementary. The elementary was closed and locked. The trailer park was off limits. Birchwood was apparently bad. The radio was dead. My own dispatch had told me to use my head. Using my head meant I had to think about fuel. I'd left the lot with a 3/4 tank, which on a Bluebird that age and with that route meant about 140 miles of running before I'd be looking at the gauge. I'd already done about 12. The bus didn't have any food on board. Didn't have any water beyond what the kids had in their lunchboxes. Didn't have a working heater on anything but the lowest setting because of the stuck blower. The temperature outside was in the low 50s and falling. I could not drive aimlessly. Every minute I drove with the kids on board was a minute I was burning fuel, and a minute I wasn't getting them to a safe place. The school was locked, and I didn't have a key to the building, only to the bus lot. The closest fire station was on the south side of town, on the other side of the trailer park. The closest police station was downtown, 6 miles away through the part of town the trooper had been routing traffic out of. What I had within a reasonable distance was my own house, which was empty and small and not designed to hold 30 children. The township hall, which would be locked and unmanned at 3:40 on a Tuesday. And the Lutheran church on Concord Street, which had a basement fellowship hall, a working kitchen, and, this was the thing I kept coming back to, a pastor named Eldred Vosberg, who lived in the parsonage next door, and who I knew for certain would be home, because his wife had been sick for a year, and he didn't leave her alone in the afternoons. The church was about 4 miles away by the long way around, avoiding both Westlers and Birchwood. I knew the long way because I'd driven Marlis to that church for choir practice for 9 years. I picked up the radio one more time. "Dispatch 14, anyone 14. A boy's voice came back, scratchy and young, maybe 12. Maybe a high school freshman who'd grabbed the radio at his father's bus or at the shop. 14, this is... I don't know whose this is. Are you the elementary route? I am. Who are you? My dad's bus. He's not here. He went outside. Can you come get me? I closed my eyes. I keyed the mic. Son, where are you? He told me. He was at the high school bus barn, 4 miles in the wrong direction, on the far side of town. I told him to lock the bus from the inside, to lie down between the seats, and to stay there until his dad came back or until somebody he knew came for him. I told him my name and the route number. I told him I'd come if I could. I knew while I was saying it that I wouldn't be able to come, and I think he knew it too. He said, "Okay," in a voice that sounded older than it had 30 seconds before, and the channel went quiet. I put the bus in gear and turned around in a farmer's drive. The kids didn't ask why we weren't going to Birchwood. They'd stopped asking questions. The older ones had their faces pressed against the glass, and the younger ones were watching the older ones, taking their cues. A first grader 2 rows behind me was crying without sound, the kind of crying that just leaks out of a kid's face while they sit there with their hands in their lap. "Listen up," I said. I used the voice I used when one of the bigger boys had been throwing things. "Listen, everybody up here for a second." They listened. "There's some trouble in town today. I don't know exactly what kind. Some of your moms and dads might not be home right now where they're supposed to be. So we're going to make a little detour. We're going to go to a church I know. The pastor there is a friend of mine. We're going to wait there until your folks can come get you. While we drive, I want you all to do me one favor. I want you to sit down on your bottoms, all the way down on your bottoms, with your heads below the window line. Like a tornado drill. You remember tornado drills?" A few of them nodded. "Good. Like that. Heads down, hands over the back of your neck. I'll tell you when you can come up." A 6th grader named Tovin, who I knew from the route as a quiet kid who read paperbacks during the ride, raised his hand from the back. "Mr. Kanak, is it the biting thing?" The question hit me harder than it should have. He'd heard it on the radio. He'd been listening when Doug talked. "I don't know what it is, Tovin. Heads down." He nodded. He turned to the kids around him and started gently pushing the little ones down toward the floor, the way a herd dog noses a lamb. Every group has a Tovin. You hope they have a Tovin. He never raised his voice the whole ride. I drove the long way to the church. I passed a man on the shoulder of the road, walking the wrong direction in his pajama pants. I passed a Subaru in a ditch with the driver's door open and nobody in it. I passed an Amish wagon of all things, going at a pace I recognized as urgent. The horses at a hard trot. The man on the bench with his head turned over his shoulder, looking back at something I couldn't see. He raised one hand to me as I went by. It wasn't a wave. It was an acknowledgement, a sort of farewell from one set of strangers to another, and I returned it without thinking. The first one I actually saw was at the four-way stop at Concord and Linden. There was a woman in a bathrobe in the middle of the intersection. She was on her knees. There was something on the pavement in front of her that I did not let myself look at, because I didn't want to look at it, and because the kids, even with their heads down, could see whatever I reacted to in the rear view. I drove past her at 15 miles an hour, and she didn't look up. She was occupied. A boy near the front of the bus, a second grader named Russet, lifted his head despite my instruction and saw her. He made a sound that wasn't a word. I reached across with my right hand without looking and pressed his head back down with my palm. "Eyes on the floor," I said. "Eyes on the floor, buddy. That's a hurt lady. Other people will help her. Eyes on the floor." I do not know if Russet believed me. I don't think he did. But he kept his head down after that, and I kept my eyes on the road, and the bus kept moving. The Lutheran Church on Concord Street is a brown brick building with a low education wing on the south side and the parsonage tucked behind a row of arborvitae on the north. I pulled into the lot at 5 minutes past 4. The parsonage door was already open. Eldred Vosberg was standing on his front step in a cardigan, holding a cordless phone in one hand and a fireplace poker in the other. He'd seen the bus from his window. I rolled down my window and called to him before I'd even fully stopped. "Eldred, I've got a busload. Jolene's gone, the school's locked, the radio's out. I need to get them inside." He didn't ask a single question. He set the poker down on the step, gestured for me to swing the bus around to the side door of the fellowship hall, and disappeared back into the parsonage. By the time I had the bus parked and the kids ready to move, he was standing at the side door of the church with a key ring and his wife Mavis behind him in a wheelchair, an oxygen line in her nose, looking small and alert and unsurprised, the way long sick people are unsurprised by any new development. "Down the steps to the basement," Eldred said. "Single file, hands on the railing. Mavis, honey, you stay here at the top and count them as they go by." I did not realize until that moment how badly I'd needed someone to give me an instruction. I'd been giving instructions without rest for 40 minutes. To have a man older than me, a man with arthritis in his hands and a sick wife and no business taking on 30 children, simply tell me what to do? It nearly took my legs out from under me. I held the door, and I counted them off the bus, and Mavis counted them past her chair. And between the two of us, we agreed on the count. And I remember her looking up at me with her hand on a girl's shoulder and saying, in the matter-of-fact way of a woman who had spent her life in a church basement, "Well, that's a Sunday school class and a half." We got them down the stairs. The fellowship hall was carpeted, with long folding tables stacked along one wall and a kitchen at the far end. Eldred turned on the lights and the heat. Mavis directed the older kids to pull tables down and set out chairs along one wall, where the kids could sit in pairs. There was a closet with vinyl mats from the Sunday school program, the kind of mats they put on the floor for nap time at preschool. And Tovin, without being asked, started laying them out for the smallest kids. "Bertle," Eldred said quietly, while the kids were settling. "What do you know?" I told him what I knew. The trooper, The closed school, the radio, the woman at the intersection. I told him about Peter, who I'd brought with me because his mother hadn't been home. He listened the way pastors listen, which is without changing his face. The phones are working still, he said. Landlines. My cell is spotty. We should try the parents while we have a window. I have the route sheet on the bus. I'll get it. Take Tovin. Have him help you carry. I went out to the bus with Tovin behind me. The lot was empty. The street was empty. The light was already starting to go gray at the edges. Late October, 4:30, an hour before full dark. I pulled the route binder in the clipboard, and I grabbed the small first aid kit from under the dash, and I grabbed the 2 flares, and the road triangle, and the fire extinguisher, and the 10-pound bag of road salt I kept under the rear bench for traction. I locked the bus. Mr. Kanak, Tovin said, as we were walking back across the lot. Yeah? My mom works at the hospital. I stopped. He was carrying the binder against his chest with both arms. She works in the emergency department. I just want you to know that, in case she doesn't come. I'll call her, I said. First call I make, I promise you. He nodded. He didn't cry. I was grateful and also a little frightened by how composed he was, because in my experience, the composed ones come apart later, all at once, and he was going to be one of the ones I needed to watch. Eldred and I sat at one of the folding tables in the kitchen with the route binder between us and the cordless phone in the middle, and we started calling parents. I'd estimate we got through to maybe 2/3 of them in the first hour. Some were home and frantic and on their way. Some were not home and the call went to voicemail, and we left a careful message saying their child was safe at the Lutheran Church on Concord Street with Pastor Vosberg and Mr. Kanak, the bus driver. Some answered from places they shouldn't have been. A pharmacy, a hospital lobby, a gas station outside town. And we told them to come when they could and to be careful. And they said they would. And you could hear in their voices the recalibration of what careful was going to mean for the rest of their lives. Tovin's mother did not answer. I called the hospital main line and got a busy signal. I called twice more over the next hour and got the same. I told Tovin I'd reached her unit and she was busy but safe. I lied to him on purpose, and I am still not sure if I was right to. By 6 o'clock, parents had started arriving. Not a flood, a trickle. Headlights on the lot, then a car door, then a parent at the side door of the fellowship hall, and a child running across the carpeted room toward them, and the small ceremony of paperwork on the back of a church bulletin, where I had each parent print and sign their name and the time. I did this not because I thought anyone would ever audit it, but because the act of it, the pen, the line, the signature, gave the parents something to do with their hands during the 10 seconds before they fell apart, and gave me a record I could look back at and know who was still mine. By 8 o'clock, a little less than half the kids had been picked up. A handful more parents had called to say they were coming as soon as they could find a route through. 2 of the calls had been the kind where the parents said they were coming, but you could tell from the voice that they weren't going to make it. There was a quality of farewell in it that was unmistakable, even when the words were ordinary. A father named Lenny Bruce told me on the phone that he was at his shop in town, and the doors wouldn't hold, and he wanted me to tell his daughter, Bevy, that he loved her, and that her mother was in Sioux Falls visiting her grandmother, and would come for her when she could. He said it twice, slowly, so I'd remember the grandmother's name and the city. Then he said, "Do not put her on the phone, Mr. Kanak. Please don't. Just tell her later." I told him I wouldn't. The line went out a few seconds after that, not from him hanging up, but from something else. I didn't tell Bevy that night. I told her 2 days later, which is a different story, and which was the harder thing I have ever done. Harder than the driving was. By 10 o'clock, there were still about 18 children in the fellowship hall who had not been picked up. By midnight, there were 16. We had laid the vinyl mats out in 2 rows, and Mavis, over Eldred's quiet protest, had insisted on being wheeled down the elevator from the parsonage to the fellowship hall so she could be among the kids while they slept. She sat in her chair at the foot of the rows, with her oxygen tank and a paperback she didn't read. And the smaller children, sensing what small children always sense, gravitated toward her. 2 of them ended up sleeping with their heads on the footrests of her chair like dogs. I did not sleep. Eldred did not sleep. We sat in the kitchen with the cordless phone and the root binder, and we listened to the AM radio at low volume, and we tried to assemble a picture of what was happening from the fragments that came through. The picture was not encouraging. The county had gone, was the gist of it. Not in some apocalyptic sense. There were still police, there were still hospitals operating, there was still electricity running. But in the sense that a thing had been let out into the population that the existing systems were not designed to contain. And the systems had spent the afternoon learning that. The state was setting up what they were calling reception points. The nearest one to us was at the county fairgrounds, 11 miles away. A National Guard unit out of Madison was running it. The radio said families with children should report to a reception point if they could do so safely, and that reception points would have food, water, medical screening, and onward transport. Onward transport to where? Eldred said. They didn't say. He didn't comment. Eldred had been a pastor for 37 years. He understood the difference between what a public statement said and what it did not say. The midnight was the longest stretch. Around 2 in the morning, a man came to the door of the fellowship hall who I did not recognize, who was not on any of the parent contacts in the binder, and who said his name was Yost Kramer and that he was the uncle of one of the children on my list. He named the child. The name matched. He could not produce ID. He had a story about being the brother of the mother, and about the mother being trapped at her workplace, and about him being the next of kin. The story was plausible, and the man was not visibly drunk or armed, and the child, when I pulled him aside, said yes, that was Uncle Yost. He came to Christmas. I let the child go with him. Eldred and I had a short, low conversation in the kitchen first. The conversation was about whether we had the standing to refuse a relative whose identity the child confirmed, given that we were a bus driver and a pastor in a church basement at 2 a.m. with no legal authority over anyone. Eldred said, "Bertle, we don't have authority. We have responsibility. The two are related, but they aren't the same." I said, "If I let him go and the man is lying, I'll never sleep again." Eldred said, "If you keep him and his mother is alive and looking for him, you'll never sleep either. Pick the version you can defend tomorrow." I let the child go. I made the man sign the bulletin, and I copied his license plate off his truck. And I did not sleep that night or the night after. And as far as I know, that child made it to wherever he was going. I never heard otherwise. That doesn't mean what I want it to mean, but it's what I have. The man who came to the door at 4:20 in the morning was different. He was wearing camouflage and a dark green windbreaker with no insignia, and he had a rifle across his back on a sling, and he had a small radio clipped to his collar that wasn't transmitting. He was not a soldier. He was about 40, with the build of a man who'd done construction his whole life, and he had the careful, slightly performative calm of someone trying to seem more official than he was. He said his name was Driscoll. He said he was with a civilian response team, working in coordination with the guard at the fairgrounds. He said they were canvassing churches and schools to consolidate refugees for transport to the reception point. He said he had 2 trucks outside and could take the children to the fairgrounds in one trip. He had no documentation, He had no guard markings. He had no list of names. When I asked him what unit he was with, he said, "We're a volunteer auxiliary out of Spring Green." When I asked him how he'd known there were children at this church, he hesitated for half a second longer than a man in his position should have hesitated, and then he said, "We've been monitoring civilian channels." The civilian channel he could have been monitoring was the dispatch frequency I'd been on at 3:30 the previous afternoon, when I'd told Doug where I was. But I hadn't told Doug I was going to the church. I'd decided that after the call. Eldred was standing behind me in the doorway. He had his hand on the door frame in a way that I think was supposed to look casual, and was actually him bracing himself. "Mr. Driscoll," Eldred said, "we appreciate the offer. The children's parents have been picking them up through the night, and we're expecting more pickups at first light. I think we'll hold here and see who comes." "Pastor, I understand. I'd encourage you to reconsider. The situation in town is going to get worse before it gets better, and the window for safe transport is closing. We'll take that risk. It's not just your risk, Pastor. It's theirs." That was when I knew. The way he said it. The faint pressure in the word, theirs. Like he was reminding us of something we'd forgotten. "Mr. Driscoll," I said, "we're going to step inside and discuss it. Could you wait at your truck?" He waited at his truck. He waited a long time. While he waited, Eldred and I went back into the fellowship hall, and we did 3 things quickly. We woke Tovin, who I trusted, and we sent him to the parsonage with Mavis's house key to lock the connecting door between the parsonage and the church. We woke Bevy's older cousin Marlin, an 11-year-old who had been picked up and dropped off again by a confused aunt and who had ended up back with us. And we had him quietly help the older kids wake the younger ones and gather their backpacks. We did not turn on the main lights. We used flashlights. And I called the county sheriff's non-emergency line, which had been ringing through to a recorded message all night. And I tried the main line, which had been busy all night. And I tried the guard liaison number that the AM radio had been broadcasting on a loop. The guard liaison number answered on the 3rd ring. A woman's voice, tired, professional. I told her where I was. I told her about the man at the door. I described his vehicle and his clothing, and the absence of insignia. I asked her if there was a civilian auxiliary out of Spring Green. There was a pause. She said, "Sir, there is no civilian auxiliary working with us. We are not subcontracting transport. If a civilian is at your location representing themselves as guard-affiliated, that is a misrepresentation. Do not release any persons into his custody. We can have a unit to your location in approximately 40 minutes. Are you in immediate danger? I don't know. Are there children at your location? Yes. How many? I told her. I gave her the number. She said, "Stay inside. Lock everything you can lock. Do not engage him. 40 minutes. I went back to the door of the fellowship hall. Driscoll was still at his truck. He had been joined by another man who had come out of the second truck, a flatbed with a canvas cover over the bed. The second man was smaller, leaner, and was holding a flashlight with one hand and what looked like a clipboard with the other. The clipboard was a nice touch. I opened the door 6 inches. "Mr. Driscoll, we've decided to hold here. Thank you for the offer. Please leave the property." He looked at me. He looked at the door. He looked at the windows of the fellowship hall where someone, I don't know who, one of the kids, had pressed their face against the glass for half a second and then disappeared. "Sir," he said, "I'd ask you to reconsider one more time." "I have. Please leave. There are people who are going to be very concerned that those children are not at the reception point this morning. Then they can be concerned to the guard who I just spoke with." His face did a very small thing, just a tightening at the corner of the mouth. He looked at the second man. The second man closed his clipboard. "Pastor," Driscoll said, past me to Eldred, "I hope you understand what you've done." They got in their trucks. They drove out of the lot. They took a left at the end of the block and went south. 40 minutes is a long time to sit in a basement with the lights off. I will not pretend I knew, in those 40 minutes, what those men had intended. I have my suspicions, and they are dark, and I have not made peace with the version of the night where I would have loaded 16 children into the back of a flatbed truck because a man in a windbreaker had a calm voice. I am old enough to know that traffickers have always done well in disasters, and I am old enough to know that I almost made the wrong call by inertia. The guard arrived at 5:15. 2 Humvees, a 5-ton truck, a corporal named Echeverria who couldn't have been older than 26, and a medic. They were professional, fast, and tired. They had radios that worked. The corporal listened to my account of Driscoll with a flat, attentive face and asked me twice to repeat the description of the second man's flashlight. He took down the license plate I'd written off the second man's truck. He asked Eldred if any of the children had been allowed to leave with anyone whose identity had not been confirmed, and Eldred told him about Yost Kramer, and the corporal wrote that down too, without comment. He asked me what I wanted to do. He said it like that, not what we were going to do, what I wanted to do. I had not been asked what I wanted to do in 19 hours. I wanted to take the remaining children to the fairgrounds. I wanted to do it on the bus, not in a guard truck, because the bus was what they knew, and because I had the route binder and the parents' phone numbers and the careful list of who had been signed out by whom. And I wanted to put that list directly into the hands of whoever was running the reception point and not have it pass through a chain of strangers. I wanted Eldred and Mavis to stay at the parsonage, because Mavis could not safely travel, and I wanted the guard to escort the bus. The corporal listened. He said okay. He said the bus would be slow but visible, which had advantages and disadvantages, and that he could put a Humvee in front and one behind, and that the medic would ride on the bus with me. He said the fairgrounds was 11 miles by the route they'd come in on, and that they had cleared that route once, but he wouldn't guarantee it had stayed clear. He asked me if I had fuel. I had a little under a half tank. He said that was enough. We loaded the children onto the bus at 5:40 in the morning. The eastern sky was the color of an old bruise. Eldred stood at the door of the church and shook each child's hand as they went past. He shook mine last. He said, "Bertel, you did the work tonight. I want you to remember that you did the work." I told him I didn't know if I had. He said, "That's how you know." Mavis, from her chair inside the door, called Tovin back. She gave him her paperback. I do not know what book it was. She said, "When you're done, you give it to your mother." Tovin said he would. He got on the bus. The drive to the fairgrounds was the strangest 11 miles of my life. The sun was coming up behind us, and the road that ran east of town through the river bottoms was empty in a way that roads are not normally empty. And the corporal's Humvee was 100 yards ahead of us with its lights on, and the second Humvee was 100 yards behind us. And the bus was full of children who were no longer crying because they had run out of crying, who were sitting low in their seats with their heads below the window line because I had asked them to, and because they had figured out by then that I was not going to ask them to do anything that wasn't necessary. The medic, whose name was Ophelia Stannard, sat on the steps of the bus next to me with her radio on her shoulder and a kit between her boots. She did not try to make conversation. Once, about halfway, she said, "You're doing fine, sir." I think she could see my hands on the wheel. They had started shaking somewhere around mile 4, and I had not been able to make them stop. She did not reach over to touch my arm. She just said the words and looked back out the windshield. We passed 3 things on the road that I will not describe in detail, because I am following the rule of not making children imagine things they don't have to imagine. I will say that 2 of them were stationary, and 1 of them was moving across a field at a steady walking pace toward a farmhouse that did not have any lights on. I will say that the corporal's Humvee did not stop for any of them, and that the bus did not stop, and that the children kept their heads down because I had told them to, and because Tovin, in the back, was talking to them in a low, steady voice about an island in a book, telling them what the island looked like and what kind of trees grew on it, the way you'd narrate a movie to a blind person. I have wondered since whether the book was Mavis's. I never asked him. The fairground's reception point was a chain-link enclosure around the show arena and the 4 big agricultural barns, with concertina wire on top, and guard trucks at the gate, and a reception line that snaked across the parking lot. There was a triage station and a registration station, and a station where someone took your photograph, and another where someone took the children's photographs separately and put a wristband on each of them. The wristbands had numbers, and the numbers were entered into a laptop. I stood in the registration line with my route binder under my arm, and I read the names off the binder one at a time, and a young woman in a guard uniform typed each name into the laptop, and at the end she printed me a sheet with all of the names on it, and a number that she said was the family unit number assigned to Kanak Bertil, Guardian of Record, Transient. "I'm not their guardian," I said. She looked at me. She had been on shift, I would later learn, for 19 hours. "Sir," she said, "as of right now, you are. We'll reassign as parents are located. Until then, the system needs a name on the line." I signed the line. I want to be careful here, because the next part is the part where I have to describe what happened to the children, and I have to do it in a way that does not flatten it. The reception point at the fairgrounds was, by the standards of what was happening across the state and the country, well run. They had food. They had water. They had cots in the agricultural barns. They had a system for matching children to incoming parent inquiries, which by the second day was running off a satellite uplink and a paper backup. Over the course of the next 3 days, 11 of the kids on my list were claimed by parents, grandparents, or court-confirmed relatives who came to the fairgrounds in person. 2 more were transferred to a state-run children's facility in Wausau on the 4th day, because no relative had been located and the fairgrounds was being reorganized for adult intake. 3 were eventually relocated with a family that took them in on a long-term basis, 2 of whom, Bevy among them, I have been in touch with since. Tovin's mother walked into the fairgrounds on the morning of the 3rd day. She was wearing scrubs that she had not changed in 70 hours, and she had a bandage on her left forearm and a temporary ID badge that said she had been cleared by medical screening. And she walked the length of the agricultural barn looking at each cot. And when she got to Tovin's cot, he was reading Mavis's paperback, and he did not see her until she was 3 feet away from him. He stood up. He did not run to her. He walked to her. He put his arms around her waist and pressed his face into the front of her scrubs. And he did not say anything, and she did not say anything. And they stood there in the aisle of the barn for what I would estimate was 4 minutes, while other people walked around them. I watched them from the entrance because I had not yet allowed myself to leave, even though by the 3rd day I had been told twice that I was free to go. Ophelia, the medic, came and stood next to me at one point during those 4 minutes. "Mr. Kanak," she said, "you can go home now. There's nothing else here for you to do. There's a few who haven't been claimed. There's a system for that. It's not your system anymore." "I know." "You drove the bus, sir." "I know." She left me there. The boy and his mother stood in the aisle. I went home that afternoon. The guard gave me a ride in a Humvee because the bus had been requisitioned, and I was told it would be returned to the district when conditions allowed. It never was. I assume it is still parked at the fairgrounds, or that it was driven somewhere else by someone who needed a bus. And that's fine. It was the district's bus. It wasn't mine. The town did not come back to what it had been. I will not pretend it did. The trailer park at Wessler's Corner was eventually cleared, and the lots stood empty for 2 years before the township started selling them off. The Birchwood subdivision was relocated as a unit to a new development west of the highway, and the streets there are named after the streets in the old subdivision, which was a strange decision that I have come to understand. The high school bus barn, the one where the boy on the radio had been, was found 3 days later with the bus still locked from the inside and the boy still in it. He had eaten all of his lunch and most of another kid's lunch, and he had been afraid, but he had not been hurt, and his father had not come back, and he was reunited with an aunt in Eau Claire on the 5th day. I met him once, 2 years later, at a memorial gathering at the elementary school. He was taller than me by then. He thanked me for telling him to lie down between the seats. I told him I hadn't done anything for him. He shook my hand anyway. Eldred Vosberg died in 2024 of a heart attack at the pulpit during a Sunday morning service. Mavis lived another 9 months after him, in the same parsonage, with a niece who came to live with her. I was at both funerals. At Eldred's, I was asked to speak, and I told the story of the night he had stood at the parsonage door with a fireplace poker and a cordless phone, and had not asked me a single question before opening the church basement to a busload of children. I told the part where he said responsibility and authority were related, but not the same. I told the part where he said, "Pick the version you can defend tomorrow." I did not tell the part about Driscoll, because Driscoll is still out there somewhere, presumably, and because the families of the children who were on my bus that night do not need to know how close I came. Peter Bonesack's mother was found alive on the 4th day, at her workplace 40 miles away, where she had been trapped in a freezer for 2.5 days and had walked out when the building had been cleared by a guard sweep. She came to the fairgrounds, and she signed for him. And she fell down onto the gravel of the parking lot when she saw him, and a corporal helped her up. I do not think Peter ever told her that he had stood on his front step and looked at his empty driveway, or that I had almost let him off the bus, or that I had brought him with me only because the look on his face had told me that something was wrong in a way I could not make myself ignore. I have not told her either. It is not my information to give. Bevy's mother was located in Sioux Falls. She drove 14 hours through what had become by then a difficult and dangerous corridor. She arrived at the fairgrounds on the 7th day. By that time, Bevy had been told about her father. I had told her on the 2nd morning, sitting on the cot next to her with my hand on the back of her hand, because I had promised her father I would, and because Eldred had told me that promises made to dying men are the kind of promises that have to be kept, whether or not you want to keep them. She did not cry while I told her. She cried later that night, and a woman from the guard sat with her, and the next morning she ate her breakfast and asked me if she could keep the bulletin he had not signed, the one I'd been planning to use when he came to pick her up. I gave it to her. She still has it. I know because I asked, the last time I saw her, which was at her high school graduation in 2031. I drove a school bus for 1 more year after the outbreak, in a different district, on a smaller route. Then I retired. I did not retire because of what happened. I retired because my hands, which had started shaking on mile 4 of the drive to the fairgrounds, had never fully stopped. They are steady most days. On bad days they shake, and on bad days I do not trust myself with 30 children in a 40-foot vehicle on a public road. And a man who does not trust himself with that responsibility has no business holding the wheel. People ask me sometimes what I learned. They ask the way people ask, hoping for a sentence they can carry. I do not have a sentence. What I have is the binder, which I still own, with the names on the route sheet and the parents' signatures on the back of the church bulletin, in pen, in ink that has not faded. I have the name of a woman at the guard liaison line whose voice told me that no civilian auxiliary was working with them. And I have the memory of the half-second of hesitation before Driscoll said the word monitoring. And I have the memory of standing in the door of the fellowship hall and saying, "Please leave the property," to a man who was almost certainly intending to take 16 children somewhere they would never be heard from again. And I have the memory of being saved from making a worse decision, not by my own judgment, but by the small wrongness of a hesitation in another man's voice. What I learned, if I had to put it to a sentence, is that the work of taking care of children in a disaster is not the work of being brave. It is the work of staying inside the small zone of competence you actually possess, and refusing to expand it to fill the size of the emergency. I drove the bus. I called the parents. I made a list. I asked an old man for help, and he gave it. I let one child go with a relative whose identity I could not fully verify, and I did not let 16 children go with a stranger whose story I could not verify. And the difference between those two decisions was not a difference of bravery. It was a difference of what each decision asked me to ignore. The first asked me to ignore an absence, a missing piece of paper. The second asked me to ignore a presence, a wrongness in a voice, a clipboard that was a prop, a windbreaker without insignia, a hesitation half a second too long. You can sometimes risk ignoring an absence. You should never ignore a presence. That is what I learned. And it is not a sentence anyone wants to carry, because it does not promise that you will be right. It only promises that you will know, afterward, which mistake you made. The bus is still at the fairgrounds as far as I know. The fairgrounds are a fairgrounds again. They hold a county fair every August. I went once, in 2027. I walked through the agricultural barn where the cots had been. There is a 4-H goat show held in that barn now. The goats are tethered along the same aisles where the cots had been, and the children who show the goats are about the age of the children who slept on those cots. And the air smells like hay and animals, and the particular dust of an old wooden building, which is what it had smelled like in 2024, too, underneath the smell of disinfectant and adrenaline and unwashed kids. I stood in the aisle for a while. A girl came past with a goat on a lead and asked me if I was lost. I told her I was not lost. She nodded and went on. I walked back out to the parking lot, and I drove home in a car I had bought used the year before, on roads that had been repaired, past fields that had been replanted. And I went home to a house that was still the house Marlis and I had bought in 1986. And I sat at the kitchen table, and I ate a sandwich, and I went to bed. And I slept all the way through the night for the first time in a long time, which is not the same as having been forgiven, but is, I have come to think, what is offered to people like me in place of forgiveness, and which I have learned to take.